Ko Andrea Ting, aho, and welcome to this public health seminar. So it's my privilege, I don't know why I get the privilege, but I'm very privileged today to introduce Professor Tony Blakely, who's going to be talking to us. And Tony's well known to most of you, many of you, has been an epidemiologist here for several, perhaps I could say many years. Hopefully it's not too offensive. But yeah, Tony's well known to you all, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. So this is looking at how much of Māori and European differences in mortality are due to socioeconomic position and smoking, and using some new and exciting methods, which Tony will explain. So yeah, we may go a little bit longer than our normal 45 minutes. So we've allowed up to an hour, up to 1:30. We'll definitely be finished by 1:30. But if you have to go, you have to go. So I'll hand it over to Tony.
Thank you, Andrea. This is going to be fun. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about how much the association of ethnicity with mortality over a 30-year time period is due to socioeconomic position, and then socioeconomic position and smoking considered together. And we're then going to do something called control effects. Now, I deliberately put naturally in quotation marks there because some of you may find it offensive. I'm talking about the natural mediation of ethnic inequalities. This is language from current counterfactual approaches, and you can think about historically. The first research question is about looking in the rear vision mirror, about what explains how we got to where we are now. The second research question was we're going to reach in there, the hand of God, and we're going to set tobacco at a certain level, which is imagining what the world would be like in the future if we eradicated tobacco. But in the jargon, that's a natural effect and that's a controlled effect. That's where that jargon comes from. And then the third point, I want to generate some discussion today about how New Zealand Inc. could really amp up on what we do. I'm going to show you today what many of you would consider to be rather complex methods. I don't believe that's the case. I think they're just contemporary methods. And I'm going to try and explain it to you in a way that you go, oh yeah, that's not too hard. And what I'm trying to advocate here is New Zealand making better use of its data by applying contemporary methods. We may not develop those methods, but we can be quick adopters and actually get ourselves into a position of improving higher quality information for policy and also leading the world as far as papers and journals, yada, yada. That's what I'm here to do today. I'm here representing the BODE group, which I direct, census mortality study, but also the Virtual Health Information Network for reasons that will become apparent at the end of the talk. I'm going to be talking largely about a paper that's just gone online, early online in the journal Epidemiology, which for the geeks amongst us, that's the really geeky journal in epidemiology. And the reason it got accepted there, I think, is because we've got 30 years of data to look at causal mediation analysis. That's never been done before. If you want to find it, just Google any George Disney's one of the co-authors, easy name to remember, put Blakely, Disney and mediation there and you'll find it. I'm going to be using the data that I set up when I started here many decades ago, as Andrea implied, the New Zealand Census Mortality Study, where we linked the census to mortality data, creating short duration cohort studies at 6 points in time. So 30 years covered by 6 short duration cohort studies. I'm going to be focusing on 25 to 74-year-olds, yada, yada, yada. You guys pretty much know this stuff. Just trust us. Just very briefly, smoking. There are big gaps by ethnicity. You all know this. I'm not going to dwell on it. They're tending to come down. You get changing absolute and relative inequalities and that sort of thing. The methods I'll be presenting today deal with the fact that smoking and its association with mortality is quite different on a relative risk scale between Māori and non-Māori. Smoking is also coming down when you look at it by income tertile, but there are gaps opening up as well. So just thinking about it from the one mediator at this point of view of smoking, we have changing associations with the first group of mediators, which is socioeconomic position over time. There's a lot going on, as you would expect when you're looking at 30 years of evolving social and tobacco history. I'm going to steal some slides from my good friend and colleague John Lynch, who I teach advanced epi with each year. And I really like this diagram. And it's because it sort of explains all we do in epidemiology with a DAG. X's are exposures, Y's are outcome, M's are mediators, L's are time-varying confounders, and C's are confounders. But what really matters here is the first task of epidemiology is to describe the distribution of health states. It's what the GBD does on steroids with big machine learning, descriptive epidemiology. In most of what we think about epidemiology is we describe the XY association. Is smoking associated with lung cancer? Are power lines associated with brain cancer? That sort of thing. But often we can't change our exposures, so we're quite interested in the mediator because we might be able to act on the mediator. So in this talk, we're going to be talking about ethnicity as the exposure and then socioeconomic position and smoking as the mediator, because we can act on that with policy. We can change the world by changing the mediator, but not necessarily the exposure. And we're going to be talking about pigs flying quite a bit, actually. There's something called the potential outcomes approach, or counterfactual way of thinking. Epidemiology is going through a revolution at the moment. The bus has been backed out from 20 years ago, where you got taught about a cohort of soldiers walking forward over time and we studied them, yada, yada, yada. The bus is backing out and we're coming back in thinking about everything from a counterfactual perspective. We imagine what people's outcomes would have been had they been exposed or unexposed. Hence the jargon, potential outcomes approach, and thinking in that manner. So what are we going to do today? There's our exposure and our outcome. And we're going to look at the mediation. How much of that association with Māori, we're going to be looking at Māori, non-Māori pretty much exclusively today, with mortality is mediated by socioeconomic factors and by tobacco. Now notice the red line there. Some of the pathway from ethnicity to mortality may go outside of the SEP pathway, but a lot of it's going to go through SEP, socioeconomic position. So your socioeconomic position that's caused by your ethnicity due to historical reasons, racism, all the rest of it, is probably going to be influenced by your income, but there'll be some other pathways, and we'll come back to that. It actually matters in what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to ask about how much is mediated through that pathway and that pathway, the two combined. So research question 1, how much of Māori European other mortality inequality is mediated by SEP, and tobacco over time and changing over time? We're going to use those things called natural, direct, and indirect effects. In the second research question, we're going to do the hand of God, reach in there and change the mediator, like we're a Minister of Health or getting tobacco out of New Zealand. And that's what we're going to do. And that's why it's called control, because you're reaching in there and you're changing this mediator level. So there are two different ways to do mediation analysis. And we're going to use this potential outcomes approach, as I mentioned. It's also known as the counterfactual method. It underpins current causal mediation analysis approaches. And here one predicts what would have happened to that person or those people had countered the fact they had different exposures or different mediators. It requires lots of assumptions, but we make those assumptions explicit. About exchangeability, which is the current way that we talk in terms of confounding. The fact that this person is exactly the same as this person, other than their exposure or their mediator changed. We're making them exchangeable, other than the one variable we're interested in. It has advantages over traditional approaches. You have clarity in those assumptions, allows for those those effect modifications I was talking about, the interactions, the fact that ethnicity and smoking have a different interaction, and a range of accompanying bias analyses. But the one that matters for us today is that these methods, when they back the epidemiological bus out, we're no longer beholden to our normal log-link regression models, which give everything on a relative risk scale. We're going to predict people's outcomes, which allows us to look at on the absolute scale. What are people's risks, risk differences, and risk ratios? And that's a major advantage. I'm going to be drawing on a number of sources. There are classic sources here. This textbook by Tyler Vandervelde, if you haven't seen it, is absolutely outstanding. And there's been a huge amount of debate on this potential outcomes approach because it has implications, for example, how we consider the variable ethnicity. Are we modifying it? The paper that this is based on today that's just been published at Epidemiology, we had a lot of to and fro of those referees about how you theoretically consider what ethnicity means and how you're modifying around that. So we're not devoid of theory here, we argue about it a lot, but today I'll focus on the numbers and the methods. So here we go. Here's a bit of math, a bit of notation for you. A is exposed, in this case it'd be Māori. A star is going to be unexposed, which will be European other. M is the value of the mediators, socioeconomic position plus or minus tobacco when exposed. M star is just the value of those mediators when you're unexposed. Okay, pretty simple notation so far. Then the expected, E outside of a square brackets, means the expected value of Y, which is the outcome, mortality risk, for AM is simply the expected mortality risk for Māori with mediators Māori have when they are Māori. It's pretty simple. EYA star, M star, is just the expected mortality, it's just the mortality risk of European other. It's the mortality risk for the unexposed. So that's pretty simple so far. Indeed, remember these two grumpy old people from the Muppets? I thought this guy was going to say something new. No, nothing new here, just another self-inflated academic. So a lot of notation so far to not take us much beyond what you knew from Epi 101A. However, now we need to think about this thing called EYAM star. That is the expected mortality risk for Māori, the exposed, with counter to fact, the mediators, at the values expected had the person actually been European other. That's the twist in thinking you now need to do. You now need to start thinking counterfactually. Hey, yeah! Kimmy, that's a bit out of this world. No, Miss Piggy, this is the crossword assumption. That's what we call the crossword assumption that has to be made when you're doing these natural effects analyses. So that's what it is, the crossword assumption. That's what we need to imagine and we need to estimate to then go forward and do the causal mediation analysis. Kimmy, I've got wings. No, Miss Piggy, it's the potential outcomes approach. Or pigs on air. POA is what we call it, potential outcomes approach. That might be something you take away from today, remembering this approach. You will see it out there a lot. Potential outcomes approach, AKA counterfactual. So how do we estimate this cross-world entity? There are a number of ways. That textbook I showed you by Tyler, the first half gives you heaps of different ways and you can look up the one that works for you, yada, yada, yada. We're going to do it today by directly estimating with predictive regression models. Notice I use the word causal mediation analysis. Well, the really interesting thing about this is the first thing you have to do is predict people's potential outcomes, and then you analyze those potential outcomes in your causal mediation analysis. So let's walk through an example. TE stands for total effect, the difference between Māori and European. So 0 down here, Māori mortality rate, European mortality rate, that's where they sit. But the gap between my hands is the total effect, and that can be expressed in an absolute risk or a risk ratio, at risk difference or risk ratio. So that's what I'm talking about. Total effect is the difference in height between my two hands, between Māori and European mortality risk. Now, NDE is the natural direct effect, and NIE is the natural and direct effect. I'll come back to that in a sec. So here we go, simple diagram. There's the Māori mortality risk, there's the European other mortality risk, and there's this crossword assumption. This is the Māori mortality risk had they had European other mediators, say. And it's pretty simple maths. Total effect is 20 minus 10, gives you 10 per some unit thousand. The natural and direct effect is how much you drop from here to here. It's that part that is mediated by whatever you adjusted for to get to this point. Let's say it's by socioeconomic position, natural and direct effect. The natural direct effect is that left over. That on this arrow here, having adjusted for the pathway through here. We call this the indirect pathway, we call that the direct pathway. And then we say simply that 4 all over 4 plus 6, 4 over 10 is 40%. 40% of this association here to here appears to be mediated through this pathway. Oh, can't see the mouse? That's a blinking nuisance. Oh, there we go. So 40% of the association appears to be mediated through this pathway compared to 60% remaining here, which is the direct effect. It's pretty simple at that conceptual level. Right, how do we estimate this cross-world entity? So we need to look up, it's like a recipe book. Decide today I've got carrots and I've got eggs and I'm going to look for a recipe of those things. We have got variables. We've got an outcome that's dichotomous. We have got a mix of mediators that are continuous, categorical, and an exposure that's dichotomous. And we look up the methods, a range of methods that will work, and we select one that will work in that context. So how do we do it? We use logistic regression. We predict the hell out of the mortality risk outcome. We throw interactions at it. We're just throwing the kitchen sink at this point in time. It's a full-on predictive model. And then once we've got that full-on predictive model, we then do a very simple little trick. So there's all Māori and European in this model. We've got the coefficients being predicted out there. And then what we do is we restrict to the European other, keep the same regression model done for everybody, restrict to European other, and flip their ethnicity variable from 0 to 1. Flip them to make them look like Māori and repredict their outcome. Bam! You've got a Māori population with the European mediators because you use that population and you just change their ethnicity. Now, having done that, that group there has a different age structure from this group here. So you have to weight back up. We just use these things called IPTWs, inverse probability of treatment weights. You will hear them a lot if you haven't already. But really, all it is sexed up direct standardization. In this case, we just use the World Health Organization direct standard. That's that part there. It's easy, sort of, editor. The variables we're using, so you know our exposure by now, it's ethnicity, we've got confounders. Because we're getting so proximal here, sort of upstream, ethnicity doesn't have a lot of confounders with it. We're going to do the analysis by sex, and that really just leaves age as the confounder left out here. And we're going to have 4 measures of socioeconomic position. So this is pretty good. 4 measures of the mediator there, the construct SEP, education, log of income, neighbourhood deprivation, and labour force status. And then the second set of mediators will add in the smoking variable. Now, where you start needing computing power for this, up to this point it's been conceptual, is when you bootstrap your uncertainty intervals. And you've got to go through this thousands and thousands and thousands of times with lots of layering. And that's when you need to start having good computing power, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk, thinking about what New Zealand could do to increase our salience to policymakers and academic outputs in the next 10 to 20 years. Okay, here we go. These are the results. So this is the total effect at this point in time. This is, let's see if I can get that mouse working. So this is the risk difference, the difference in height between my 2 hands. So this is the risk difference, the difference between Māori and European over mortality risk with bootstrapped confidence intervals on it there. So this is in the early 1980s, late 1990s, and late 2000s. So 30 years covered here for males 25 to 74, females 25 to 74, mortality risk difference per 100,000. And so it's kind of not too different over time, because remember the inequalities are increasing in relative risk terms, but here we're looking at it in absolute terms. Now we put on there the natural indirect effect. This is the amount of that that is explained by adjusting for socioeconomic position for those mediators. And you can see the confidence intervals on this, and you see it bobbing about. The next thing we do is we add to those 4 socioeconomic factors the smoking variable. Now let's look at this really closely. Start over here. See how it steps up there? So we can see that smoking is adding to the amount of mediation over and above socioeconomic position for females. But over here, there's not much of a shift. Ah, there. Okay, let's do it again. Do shout out if the mouse disappears. That's the step up from here to here. So by adding in smoking for females, we're explaining that much more of the gap between Māori and European other. But over here for males, it still increases a tiny wee bit, but not that much, which is quite interesting, because actually what it means is that for females, this pathway is more important. For males, any effect of tobacco is largely going through there. So when we adjust for SEP, we also adjust for this. And hang on, actually that makes a lot of sociological and historical sense, because we know during colonisation, with tobacco as a trade item, that Māori females took up smoking very early on and have always had high smoking rates, regardless, or as well as for socioeconomic reasons. So there's sociological validity in this idea that smoking adds something more to the female equation than it does to the males when you've already got SEP in there. More is going through that red pathway for females. Now, what I've done now is I've added on an extra axis here. This is the percentage mediator. This is the percentage of the gap between my hands that is explained by these mediators. And so what you can see here is remarkably stable over time for males, 47% at all 3 points in time. It made writing the abstract a lot easier. But it's increasing over time for females. Now that would make sense too, because what's happening here is you've got increasing labour market participation, yada yada, for females going from the post-World War II period up to the 2 noughties. So socioeconomic differentiation and what it does for your life chances is going to be increasingly important. So it's explaining more of those ethnic gaps over time. Now look at the width of these confidence intervals. It's starting to get quite wide. We can't actually tell you with high precision what exactly each percentage mediation is each point in time. There's quite a lot of uncertainty, but there clearly is an increasing trend there for females. Now, that's the explanation due to just SEP. For SEP and tobacco combined, that's the red bar. And so you can see there's not much difference for males, because a lot of that tobacco is already captured by their socioeconomic differences between Māori and European, but it does increase quite substantially for females, at least based on the data we had, the assumptions we made, and the best damn analysis we could do in the South Pacific. So there you go. Perhaps up to about 50% of differences between Māori and non-Māori can be explained by socioeconomic position and tobacco. Now, in all reality, it's going to be more than that, because even though we've got 4 socioeconomic factors in there, they're all going to be mismeasured. It's only going to be your income in the last year, not your income over the life course, yada, yada, yada. So maybe it's about 2/3, something like that. It's not going to be all of it. It won't double in its size. There are residual explanations for ethnic differences over and above SEP, for example, racism, different access to health services that's due to skin colour, not just due to socioeconomic position, etc. But this is as good as we can get empirically. Now, these lines here have wide confidence intervals, but we can actually look to see how much difference there is explained here. Each one of the iterations that generates this confidence interval in the bootstrap will have a mate down here, and we can compare those differences, and the confidence interval for the difference between these two is a lot tighter than just saying the percentage mediated is this with this much uncertainty, but the difference between those two is a bit tighter. And this is what I've got here. So I've got a lot of results up here, which we've already seen, but just focus on the red line. This is the increase in mediation due to adding tobacco. So you can see even for males, even though it's only a 2 percentage point increase, the confidence intervals exclude the null, and a nearly 8% increase in mediation for females in the late 2 noughties. So that was looking in the rear vision mirror about how we got to where we are by 2006, 2011, and explaining the past. Now we're going to reach in there for controlled effect and actually, hand of God, put a policy in place there. And we're going to do controlled effects. So what we're going to do now, it's a similar trick. Remember when I did my hands like this, and we did the regression model for everybody? And then I limited it to European other, and I flipped their ethnicity to Māori to get their potential outcomes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave everybody in there, get the best regression model, and then I'm going to flip everybody's tobacco variable to be never smoking and repredict everybody's potential outcome thousands of times and reanalyze what happens to their mortality risk. See that? Regress the hell out of them, get your best model, and then flip that tobacco variable for everybody who wasn't never already to never, and see what happens to their mortality risk. So it's equivalent to the fact to an analysis had tobacco never arrived in New Zealand. So I've just explained that with a lot of hand waving, so we'll skip over it in the interest of time. I do quite a lot of hand waving in case you haven't noticed. Now we have a highly policy relevant question. So the previous part was interesting to us as academics and historians and understanding where we got to, but now we're really starting to hit the policy apple, as it were. I call this, I've already done the Kermits for the 1970s, Muppets from the 1970s. This is my Everybody's a Winner Baby, Hot Chocolate 1978 slide. Why is everybody a winner baby? Because look, this is the observed Māori and European mortality risk for males and observed for females. The lighter shade here is what would happen to the Māori mortality risk had they never been exposed to smoking, based on our best analysis, and the European one. Everybody's a winner because everybody's mortality risk goes down. So everybody's a winner. But we're going to look at it a little bit more closely, and we're going to focus on these things here, which are not error bars, but just to visually help you on what the gap is between here and here. So that's the risk difference between Māori and European as they are in 2006, 2011. And this is what we think it would be had there never been smoking in New Zealand. We call that the controlled direct effect. It's that effect left due to ethnicity having controlled the tobacco variable, having set it at never. And it's good news. It reduces by 15% for males, and it reduces by 24% for females. Show me any other intervention you could possibly do that would reduce ethnic inequalities and mortality by 24%. I think this is it. So excellent. On an absolute, I emphasize that word, on an absolute scale, we have strong reduction in inequalities. On a relative scale, it's not the case. Those rate ratios, dividing the height of that bar by the height of this bar, and the height of that bar, you get my point. They actually go up for males because your reference group has gone towards 0, and so the relative difference can go up, and it hardly changes at all for females. This is a very common conundrum in inequalities and in epidemiology of inequalities, is that you can see absolute inequalities going down, but relative staying the same or even going up. I still think a world where the absolute inequalities are going down and the relative aren't going down, I'd still take that. And that may be the way of the future for the next wee while as we wash out the tobacco epidemic, then try and get on top of the obesity epidemic. But it's not nirvana, which would see both absolute and relative inequalities coming down. So in this, when we're doing controlled effects, we talk about percentage eradicated because we're reaching and they're controlling. We're eradicating something. In this case, we actually did eradicate tobacco. But in this jargon, we talk about percentage eradicated rather than percentage mediated. And so what you can see is, on an absolute scale, 12% or 21% for females. That ain't bad. So tobacco-free goal, let's keep going for it. It's probably going to be one of our most important ways to reduce inequalities on an absolute scale. I've done very well on time, I think, Andrea, to your surprise, and probably half the audience's surprise. I just want to acknowledge all my co-authors before I change gear to the New Zealand Inc. in the future. So Lyle Guerin is a statistician at the University of Melbourne, where I have a joint appointment. June Atkinson, Data Manager Supreme here, worked with me on the New Zealand census-mortality study for too long. Andrea, who you've just met. Nick Wilson, sitting just here, Tobacco Guru. John Lynch, my colleague, and Rebecca Bentley, my colleagues who have helped me with the potential outcomes approach in teaching advanced EPI. And of course, this is approved by Statistics New Zealand and all that sort of stuff. Okay, I now want to talk about what I want to recommend for really lifting the game in New Zealand for analysis of routine data and doing the type of research I've shown you. That type of research, yes, it's contemporary. To many of you, it's complex, but actually I suggest it's just contemporary methods. How can we do more of that? How can we harness the value of New Zealand data? That's what I want to talk about now. So I'm going to do a very simple SWOT analysis. Many of you will not agree with this, and I'm hoping this will generate some discussion. New Zealand has, you won't disagree with that one, I don't think. New Zealand has amazing data. We've got the Dunedin and Christchurch longitudinal studies. We've got Growing Up. We've got the CMS. We've got Cancer Trends. We've got Philippus Housing Work. We've got lots of you in this room have contributed various data sets here. And we have the Statistics New Zealand integrated data infrastructure, which really is going to become one humongous longitudinal study. New Zealand researchers, you guys, we ask interesting questions. We're top of our game in that. And we have good links to policy. So we can even ask and even talk to policymakers about our analyses. That's a strength you don't see in a lot of other countries simply due to size. So in this case, our small size is our advantage. Stats New Zealand is one increasingly centralised data custodian. I spend a lot of time in Australia. Data linkage over there is a mess because it's done by heaps and heaps of separate agencies who then don't talk to each other. There's duplication of effort, all that sort of stuff. A really key strength we have here is a lot of that data is done by Stats New Zealand. They hold it in one place, one sandpit. Great. But we have some weaknesses. Researcher capacity for dealing with missing, messy, and mismeasured data. It's the reality of dealing with administrative data. I think we should be employing far more people at associate professor and professor level with expertise in statistics, imputation, multiple over imputation, measurement error, regression calibration. We need that capacity to benefit from the data we've got and to stay at the cutting edge internationally and, of course, get better estimates back for policymakers. We need better capacity for longitudinal analysis. I set up the Sophie Health longitudinal study, at least the health part of it, about 15 odd years ago. And one of the remarkable things about that is the majority of analyses still just look at that longitudinal study as repeated cross-sections, not actually Brian's smiling and nodding at me, not harnessing the value of that repeated measures and how people change over time and capitalising on that with things like fixed effects analysis, which is not too hard to do. You just need to know how to do it. Contemporary causal methods. Notice I'm no longer using the word advanced. I use the word contemporary because I think it is just contemporary methods. Much better address source. It's not a panacea, but these methods are so much better than what we used to do last century, which is only 18 years ago. It's all due to smaller population, lack of fellowships. We have strengths here. We get funded with overheads, which gives us leverage back on the university and should therefore allow us to lobby more for what we want. It doesn't always happen that way. But we do lack the fellowships which create that critical mass at the lecturer, senior lecturer, and associate professor level, in my view. So we need to find ways of getting around that. We do need better IT and data systems. Stats New Zealand has done an amazing job, but the system is still groaning. If you want to go in there and do some machine learning, you're going to pretty much tip the system over. You want to do that really full-on prediction. So we need to think about the future and start improving those data systems. The government statistician is very much aware of that and very much supportive of this co-puppet or direction. The opportunities as I see them, and you may wish to have different ones, and we'll start a discussion in a sec. Collaboration. New Zealand's good at collaboration. We're a small country, we're not as competitive of a country, so that's one of the strengths we should draw on. Barbara may have noticed that in her many visits over here. We're more collaborative perhaps than most other places. Yeah? Yeah. Well, I made you say that because So things like the Virtual Health Information Network that Andrea drives with a bit of help from me and Cherie, wherever she is, she's probably here somewhere. There she is at the back. And so we try and do this collaborative approach. Also international and across universities. Most of you are aware that I have a particular view on this. And I'm bringing University of Melbourne colleagues over here, and we're starting to do some really good stuff. And Neville's nodding at me. We're starting to spill that over. So people are seeing what these guys are doing, coming into the data lab and picking up some of those skills. I think that's important. The national science challenges are important because they are a vehicle, an existing platform that cuts out the research office in Otago, to be blunt, and actually create something above the universities that you can go to, which is a bit bigger than just Otago or Massey or Canterbury or Auckland. The Statistics Act, that is perhaps our really key opportunity and advantage here. It actually provides a mechanism, and we have strong social license to this point. Don't take it for granted, but we do have strong social license to this point. Threats. Keeping that governance, ethics, social license and data sovereignty, particularly Māori data sovereignty, but not only Māori data sovereignty process up to it. Keeping ahead of the curve, making sure the public's on side, not stuffing it up, which is the next threat, is researchers behaving badly. Imagine if I got one of my University of Melbourne colleagues to come over here and then they went back to Australia and they published something somewhere talking about how Māori behave badly and all that stuff with no Māori health researchers on that paper. That would be dumb. But we need to guard against that type of research behaving badly thing. There's an example also at University of Melbourne, not involving New Zealand data, where some researchers deliberately went to de-confidentialise data. They identified the health service providers. They thought they were doing a public good in that aspect by publishing and doing a lot of media work on how they'd managed to identify health service providers with anonymised data. Really dumb. And the part over there is that Australia doesn't actually have on statute that thou shalt not do that. At least in New Zealand, it says thou shalt not do that. So protecting that and making sure researchers can't behave badly if they're even thinking about it. Key threat is a lack of resources in a small country. We're only 4.8 million. We're not 26 million. So we've got to use our resources well. Possible solutions. Here's what I think might be the way forward. I think things we're doing already are important. And so, for example, Neville, Andrea, and Gabriel, who are doing their big data thing, with the generosity of the University of Otago for something like 0.4 FTEs, we need to scale up on a big data center. I mean, say, universities around the world, they're putting in funding for 10 or 20 researchers. They're investing in this. We are not investing in this in the way that we should be in New Zealand. We're relying on everybody dispersed around the country to do their own little thing and good to come of that. I think at this point in time, it requires a bit more cohesion and a deliberative step forward. So therefore, I think we need serious investment in data governance, the IT infrastructure. It's coping at the moment, the IDI, with most analyses that a policymaker might want to do and that we would do before we move into machine learning and all these predictive and bootstrapping algorithms. But that's not going to be the future. We need to seriously increase that infrastructure. I am personally of the view that we need to set up a centre. Be that in one building in Wellington, or actually 3 buildings around the country, or in 3 academic departments around the country, or in a shared services group of DHBs with 2 academic groups, with each with 7 people, whatever it is. We need that critical mass that then flows on out. There's a point in time you need to bring people together to get the skill up and then spill it back out to the rest of the community. We need data scientists, statisticians, epidemiologists, econometricians working together. Peter Davis, who helped me with my PhD way back, always used to talk about the fact, he used to ring me up and say, Tony, you know you're a doctor and you're an epidemiologist, but actually you're doing quantitative sociology and there's bugger all people in New Zealand doing quantitative sociology. So Brian's an example of a quantitative sociologist. There are a few of us, but not a lot of us, and we need more of that. And I want to stop there and see what you think. You may have questions about the main presentation or perhaps about these discussion points I'm raising. So I hope that was both entertaining and interesting and possibly even provocative in making you think about the future. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tony. So let's take some questions. Now, I've got a microphone that's going to go around. Richard, we talked to him first, and there's also online, so you have the capacity to ask questions, and Marie will bring read those out as well.
Thanks, Tony. That was fabulous. So I've got two questions, surprisingly enough, about the tobacco bit. So the first one was about the looking back exercise, and you had this sort of tobacco bit sort of was part of the effect hidden within the socioeconomic effect. So have you done the similar sort of analysis just for tobacco? So that was question one. And the second one was in your looking forward bit where you did the counterfactual of no one ever smoking. That's not quite what we're faced with. We're faced with some people never smoking, but a lot of existing smokers quitting, and of course not all of that effect's reversible, so it wouldn't quite. Are there any plans to, I mean that would be much more complex, I realise, but to look at that.
So two great questions, I've put the DAG up. The first question is, why didn't we do the looking backwards natural effects for tobacco? The answer is, of course, EMIC. Exposure-induced tobacco mediator, exposure-induced mediator outcome confounding. See this thing here? It's a confounder of that tobacco mortality association. See that? It's got an arrow going in there. It's induced by the exposure. It is actually quite hard yakka to pull out the natural direct effect for a variable that has variables prior to it affected by the exposure. It's called exposure-induced mediator outcome confounding. There are methods for doing it, randomized intervention analogues, that sort of thing. We just didn't get round to it, and we started this paper several years ago before that type of method was something that we could apply. But yes, you could go in and do it, but we didn't do it for those types of reasons. Your next question was, I reached in there and made everybody never. We could equally well, but we don't have plans for it because we don't have funding for it, is reach in there and flip everybody from never to X for a while and allow for attenuation, all the rest of it. And that's what we do in the BODE group. We do allow for that type of transition. So I was doing the thought experiment about James Cook having never bought tobacco, and there was never tobacco in New Zealand. So therefore that 22% reduction, I think it was, in the gap between Māori and European for females, it would be less than that over a 5-year period if you make everybody quit, because you'll still be run-off effects onto lung cancer and the rest of it. So yes, we could do that type of analysis. You could specify different counterfactuals.
Thank you, Tony. That was an excellent talk, and we're good to talk to you about some of the stuff in relation to cancer debate that's going on, but that's offline. I thought we might be quite fun to play devil's advocate. You'll be surprised to learn. As you know, there's been a lot of sort of noise about precision medicine. Huge amount of funding's gone into precision medicine with very little real health outcome as a result. Is it possible that that is also going on with big data? And I guess the question I would ask you is, what question can you think of that could be currently asked of our data that would change policy in a way that wouldn't be changed through other mechanisms? So, for example, your work suggests we should get people to stop smoking. Yep. And poverty is a bad thing. Well, yes. That's a huge investment you're suggesting. But is there really good evidence that, assessing what we happen to have data on is going to address the really important questions? Okay,
cool. So over here we've got bootstrapping and things like that, which improve our current type of way of doing things. And over here we have, let's just call it machine learning. It's a lot of other things, but things that predict things better. That's what DI's on about. Now, the things that predict things better up here from a health researcher's point of view, they may spill down to clinical medicine, or they might spill down to public health and quantitative stuff. When they spill down to clinical medicine, DI is asserting that it hasn't done much so far. To some extent, she's correct, but also think about the fact we're about to get rid of all radiologists, because the visual recognition stuff here is getting so good that we won't need radiologists, or at least we'll be able to pay them less, and you'll start seeing benefits down there. So, but let's put that aside. Now, what Di is really asking about was, how's it going to help people like us interested in quantitative sociology or public health and that sort of thing? So at this point, for me, it splits into three actually. Let's go three. 1, 2, 3. First one, GBD. Estimates on incidence, prevalence, you name it, every year since 1990 to 2016, for every possible country by sex and age, down to 5-kilometre radius, and now being projected out to 2040. How's that done? It's done by having 15,000 servers at the University of Washington doing amazing stuff with machine learning to get these predictions. It has all the data going in there, but it's bringing all that data together. That's far too much data and far too complex for us as humans using our bog standard logistic regression or some ARIMA model or something. It actually needs that type of mechanism. So there, descriptive epidemiology. So the first part of John Lynch's slide. The second part is the part I'm really interested in, which is understanding your XY and your XY through M associations. I look like I'm a Catholic priest. That's not what I'm trying to do. Now here, the world is changing. We backed the epidemiological bus out, and now we're going to bring it back in by doing potential outcomes. And you need to have those predictive algorithms in there to do it. Now, it doesn't make a difference. So, for example, if you're going to actually do a decent analysis on something like housing affordability through to mental health and how much is through different income, you need to really adjust well for those confounders. So I think those methods will start to make a difference. Those methods were used for understanding HRT, hormone replacement therapy, AZT treatment for HIV, because they're applied in the clinical setting where people change the treatment based on what you'd had in the past. And to unpick all that, you need to use these quite contemporary methods, which are increasingly using this type of machine learning. Now, one other thing there before I move on to the third one, in that machine learning, we are now seeing the next part of the revolution. I showed you just predicting the hell out of the outcome. Some of you have heard propensity scores where you actually predict to control the exposure. There's this thing called targeted maximum likelihood estimation, TMLE. And what you do is you do both at the same time. You're predicting how to control for your exposure or mediator as well as the best prediction on the outcome. And one of those models could be wrong. As long as one of them's right, you'll get the right answer. They are increasingly needing machine learning to predict the weights and to get those predictive equations on there. Third point is something like, now Rod Jackson's got his paper in the Lancet today, Nick? Yes, so Rod Jackson has got Predict up in the Lancet today. So this is predicting for clinicians. Now that is using pretty bog standard Cox proportional hazards models, but increasing in the future, you'll see that done with machine learning type approaches, as long as you can generalize that across time and place. So to answer your question, I get your point, is that this could be toys for researchers, but I actually think there's huge potential for gain here. And even if I think it will gain for policy, but even if it doesn't gain for policy, if we want to stay at the cutting edge, if we want to be early adopters and publishing good papers overseas, we want to adopt that because we've got, it's like having the soil in the garden. We've got the data to make good use of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't completely disagree with you, but I'm just playing. I mean, I think getting these good methods is really important, and is really critical. Of course, it's frustrating dealing with reviewers who don't necessarily get them, but just to address those points you made, GBD, I went to an interesting talk with Richard Horton, as editor of the Lancet, talking about GBD. I mean, they publish a lot of the GBD stuff, but expressing quite substantial concern because of the, very substantial assumptions that go into the GBD estimates, particularly in relation to lower middle income countries. And the problem being that people think we know what's going on because of the GBD, which stops resources going into those countries to ensure that we actually have good data. So there's quite a lot of concern in the well, there are really substantial assumptions that go into those data. So they're probably reasonably good for high-income countries, but probably much less so for low- and middle-income countries. So, there is, I mean, it's,
yep.
There are...
Do I get a word in each way, or
yeah,
do you have the mic?
What's that?
Do I get a word in each way, so you weren't even listening? I agree with a lot of you saying. And so Chris Murray and Alan Lopez set up the GBD, right? So Chris is still driving the modelling end of it. Alan has now gone to actually collecting data. So he's got gazillions from the Bloomberg to go back into the countries to do vitals registration. So they are acutely aware that you need both the modelling and the data. Now, just as a side story, I think I can say this, Alan was telling me about it, is that they did a whole lot of work in, actually this doesn't go outside of this room, okay? A whole lot of work in Burma, Myanmar, and with all the real data, and it was only about 1% difference from what the GBD predicted anyway. Now, sometimes it will be different and you need data to go in here, but actually doing it both ways is important.
Thank you. Too scared to say anything now.
So thanks very much. I'd like to talk, I'd like your thoughts on how we link this up and how we get machine learning into policy. Because we've enough, the IDI is great and it's a good platform, but for instance, I was at the IDI users forum and we were looking at the education is trying to build a better model to look at how to fund schools that have an excess number of students who would under other circumstances be troublesome or will have trouble achieving grades. Their first model, historically, they'd borrowed June's NZ depth for each area, and it was funded on having the school being in or close to areas that had low NZ depth. Then they'd looked at the NZ depth of the individuals, and now they were looking at picking out some IDI outcomes, IDI variables that could be used to better inform each individual score, add up, and looking at how many individuals with high score went into it. But they were missing things like health. They had no health indicator in it. They had no housing indicator in it. How to get the machine learning, how to get from this massive gap of policymakers doing tables to a machine learning that says, actually, if you fix this for education, you'll be fixing it for health, you'll be fixing it for social welfare, you'll be fixing it for all those things that are combined and that will deliver that real bang for buck and well-being outcome in the current government speak.
I think the answer's up there on the slide, is that I do actually think it is the time in history now, how we want to view it, I don't want to be too overstated, we actually do need a concentration of people together that are providing, I think starting from the health area, the Ministry of Health is keen on this, but quickly that would spill over into providing information for the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Development, etc. But you need a pool of people together here that are using common data and able to share that type of methodology. I think we just need to invest in it. So I'm sorry, it's a pretty simple answer. My answer's up there on the slide. Unless somebody's got a better one, I think that's the way to go. And it can be done in a business sustainable sense. If you invest in this and these guys get so good at it, then they'll be cheaper to employ on your HRC grant or rather than having your DHB services support. And you just buy the services from these people. The trick is then like a dentist. You want these guys to disappear after 20 years because the skill gets spread back out to the community. So it needs to be done on that sort of limited lifespan cycle.
Thank you. Tony, I want to be provocative, just out of character. You distinguish the effect between women and men on Māori women and, well, on all four, on the basis of socioeconomic. I want to suggest that, in fact, our measures for socioeconomic status of women are much less adequate than for men. I mean, a lot of these things were actually developed by men, and they didn't think about the differences in a woman's life cycle from men.
Yep.
And so I don't know that I have to go back into history to explain your result. I've got a different one, and that would mean I need a footnote on your changes, is that we need high quality women at the associate professor and professor level who will actually, in a whole range of social statistics area, challenge what men have assumed has always been normal.
Good. I accept your last point. On your first point, what Brian's saying, imagine the truth was up here, that 60% was due to SES and it never changed over time. Do it again. Imagine the truth was up here, that actually 60% of the ethnic differences were due to SES, and we've mismeasured it by that much for males, a constant amount of mismeasurement over time. And what Brian's saying is, well, we measured SES worse in the past for females, but because females are more in the labour force and SES has a similar meaning on a social construct, we're starting to measure it better. So this trend up, Brian's right, that might be due to changing over time or differential over time measurement error. We've said in every paper that we accept the fact that we underestimate, but we doubt that the measurement error varies over time. However, I accept your point, Brian, that maybe for females it is worse further back into time. I don't know what the truth is. I'm not quite sure how to pick away at that. I was trying to be provocative today and I'm not getting a lot of people coming back at me. It all makes sense, says Nick. Yeah, that's because Nick and I think alike. So I'll put the last slide up in case that helps people think. Or we can go back to our working day and learn more about machine learning.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And yeah, given questions have dried up, we will stop there, and yeah, come and talk to Tony if you've got any other questions you want to ask, or yeah, but yeah, can we just join together and thank Tony for.